So a little bit of history. So this is a map of the changing temperature of the Earth. We're in a warm period now. This is an ice age, another warm period. That's where it was 10 to 20 meters higher. Okay, climate change. Homo sapiens over here. You can't blame climate change on people over here. We can blame it on now because the evidence is that this carbon emission is different due to an isotopic analysis of carbon-14 and carbon-12. And carbon-14 is made in the upper atmosphere by cosmic rays. It then diffuses down and incorporates into everything, but it has a 5,700-year lifetime. We all have carbon-14 in ourselves. We die. We get a good graveyard, doesn't mix with the environment. We dig us all up 10,000 years, not 10,000, let's make it 10 lifetimes, 50,000 years. No more carbon-14, it's 10 lifetimes, okay? But if there are enough of us, we dilute the carbon-14. By measuring the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in the atmosphere, it agrees quantitatively with how much fossil fuel we've burned. We've introduced carbon that was sequestered from the environment. So it's different. Because trees and ocean cycles, most ocean cycles are shorter than that. So this is got human fingerprints all over it. But what am I talking about now? Something happened. About 12,000 years ago, started in the Middle East, the so-called Fertile Crescent in Iraq, or what is now Iraq, Iran. But it also happened in many other places in the world, North and South China, the Americas, New Guinea, Ethiopia. What happened? What happened is the climate became stable. And so one theory goes, when it's bouncing up and down like a yo-yo, you just hunt and forage and move on. But as soon as the climate became stable, remember, people were around much longer than that. Then they say, hey, we can plant stuff and then we can harvest them. Because it wouldn't, like 20 years later, it wouldn't be like kind of weather we see today. So anyway, so that was good. And so maybe a stable climate made agriculture happen. Agriculture created wealth, and you're no longer nomadic roaming around, and you can create social order, you can get kings, and you can hire physicists. And so the king's not so good, the physicist is very good. It turns out that agriculture has had as a profound impact on human development as anything else. And so this I'm taking from an article by Bob Fogel, an economist who got something associated with the Nobel Prize. They call it the Medal in the Honor of the Memory of Alfred Nobel. It's close to the Nobel Prize. And it's known as the Nobel Prize in Economics. The Swedes are very traditional bound. But I don't have to tell you that. So in any case, this is he counts a number of agricultural revolutions, beginning with the first agricultural revolution, what I just talked about. All this thing, the birth of mathematics, all these good seeds, the first irrigation, beginning of second agricultural revolution. And then what happened is productivity in agriculture started to zoom up, and when you have productivity in agriculture zooming up, you allow the population to rapidly expand. And so Fogel says it's due to the second agricultural revolution. What happened? Well, the first one, you domesticated wheat, rice, cattle, chickens, 7,000 BC down over here. Yeast for bread, 4,000 BC. First irrigation, 3,500 BC, all down here. The most important development, you can learn how to make beer and wine. Over here, what was the second agricultural revolution? It was policy change. Land was open to the public. It was called the right of the commons. And starting in Great Britain and spread to Europe, you can actually own the land, which means you can actually take care of it, which means you can make it produce. But if you were allowed to graze your cattle commonly and everything, you couldn't do anything. development of national markets within a country. You've made shipping food around in a country really good, transportation infrastructure, roads, canals, railways. There are a few other things, selective breeding, things like that, but it was policy that actually turned farming into a profitable business. Okay, we've got the second agricultural revolution, turn of going into the 20th century. Sir William Crooks of the Crookes tube became elected president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And so usually you give a talk, oh shucks, I'm so glad and honored to be here, blah, blah, blah. But he didn't start his speech that way. He said, England and all civilized countries are in deadly peril. And he said Europe, and the issue was Europe was running out of saltpeter that occurred naturally in South America, and also bird guano, that's bird doo-doo, very good fertilizer, and they were running out. And so he was saying, projecting forward in 20 years or 30 years, as the population was growing, we couldn't feed ourselves in England and everything. So he said, it is the chemists who must come to the rescue. Before we're in the grip of actual dearth, the chemists will step in and postpone the day of famine, so distant a period that we and our sons and grandsons may legitimately live without undue solicitude for the future. Very poetic. Notice he didn't mention women, but, but that was the thinking in those days. But in any case, this guy set off a race of chemists to make nitrogen-based fertilizer. Really, literally, the chemists said, hey, this is good, this is important. Fritz Haber won the race and gets a Nobel Prize for his work in 2018. But it's called the Haber-Bosch process, because he collaborated with an industrial chemist named Carl Bosch, but that was considered an injustice. So in 1931, they gave him a Nobel Prize for the same work, but they had to think of another reason, so they said, well, it's due to high pressure, high temperature catalysis. And then in 2007, Gerhard Ertl was doing some fundamental studies in service science, and in the Nobel citation, they said, at last we begin to fundamentally understand the Haber-Bosch process. So it's 2.5 Nobel Prizes. It's a big deal because it meant we could feed a growing planet. All right? Other revolutions happened. Norman Borlaug started crossing strains of wheat, and he made them very productive. So on the left-hand side here, you see these wheat grains, much more productive. In fact, they were so heavy that they would crumple over just due to the weight, so he bred in short dwarf strains and thicker stalks that would stand up. And then they were worried about fungus and other things, so he bred those things that are fungus resistant. And this really had a profound impact on agriculture. How profound? Well, he got a Nobel Prize in 1970 for his work done in the 50s and 60s. And 1960, the population was 3 billion people. 1916, population 7.4 billion people. Land under cereal production flat. So his revolution in wheat went into wheat and rice and other things. Cereal production yields, cereal production rates, all this stuff, 3.5-fold, including developing countries. Mostly developing countries, starting with Mexico, India, Pakistan. The United States was better. Corn production went up 8-fold, okay, per acre, due to many things, including fertilizer, irrigation, and cross strains, okay? So now Europe and Africa is very suspicious of genetically modified crops. But let me try to tell you that we've been modifying crops and animals for 4,000 years. For example, look at corn. This is a quiz. Which is the native corn? These guys. The other corn doesn't look like the native corn, but it's really very high yield, okay? What about animals? The full circumference of these circles is the natural lifetime of an animal like beef or pigs or chickens or turkeys. The red segment is when they're slaughtered, And so these animals are bred to mature very rapidly. And for example, pigs, after 24 weeks, they weigh 280 pounds. Cattle only a year and a half. And we're talking 1,500, 1,800 pounds. They're like little food-producing machines, so to speak. Broiled chickens only 40 days, turkeys similarly. So very, very small fraction. They're not recognizable. In the United States, some of our turkeys are so breast-heavy that they kind of fall down. They can't really go to full adulthood, and they're artificially inseminated. So, and they look different, and they act different. These are our domestic turkeys in the United States. These are our wild turkeys. We don't know how old they are. I know about how old this wild turkey is. It's, never mind. Anyway, if you don't drink bourbon, you're missing something. Anyway, so they have all these unintended consequences. The annual emissions from fertilizers made from urea, which is made from ammonia, which is made in Haber-Bosch process, starting with natural gas, first oil and then natural gas, or coal, and N2O. This is, again, the world carbon emissions. I showed you China, United States, EU, India is coming by. If beef and dairy cattle were a country and looked at all the greenhouse gas emissions from raising them, all their burping and all this other stuff, their greenhouse gas emissions would be more than the EU 28. Just dairy cows and beef, okay? And we've profoundly geoengineered the world. Just to give you an example of this, if you put humans and the animals we on one side of the scale and every other mammal on the other side of the scale, things we don't eat, like cats, dogs, maybe horses, squirrels and rats and everything else, lions and tigers and bears. We're 96% of all the biomass of the world. Okay? So when people say we don't want to geoengineer, sorry, we have geoengineered the world in a profound way. So what do? The cattle burp. It's the methane that's the contributing factor. Not all animals are the same. Beef, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, is profoundly ahead of everything else. Cheese because of dairy and dairy cattle. Pigs and poultry are not bad. They're a third, quarter of beef and fish. But of course, tofu and everything are much better. Okay, so in terms of protein, beef is still a leader of the pack by far. And the cheese and the milk are a big issue. And because of that, because of milk consumption in certain countries like India is really a big deal, and because dairy cattle burp as much as beef cattle, that's a big deal. Now, they're not quite as bad because dairy cows are allowed to live 4 or 5 years until their milk production goes down. So what to do? Well, you can eat less beef. You can make them more polite and don't burp as much. And there's research trying to convince people to eat less meat and trying to convince meat substitutes. And also changing the diets of beef. A certain type of seaweed found in Southeast Asia makes them burp 90% less. It's a huge thing. But that's, they're free range, they're not you can't do that. And so the question is, can you change their diets in where they are kept? Or can you inoculate them, because the microbes in their stomachs don't appear to be symbiotic, they appear to be mostly parasitic. So they take the food from the cattle, use it, and then make methane, but the cattle don't want it, so they burp it out. Because we know when we feed them these special diets where it's 9% less methane being burped out. It's mostly burping, by the way. It's not in the rear end. The cattle seem to be, as big and healthy. They just so that's good. There could be milk substitutes. Soy milk is good. Almond milk uses too much water. Oat milk is good in the sense that these things make more sense. And so the question is, can people develop a taste for oat milk or things like that? And it depends mostly on how old you are. My wife hates oat milk. Her granddaughters only drink oat milk, and that's the difference. And so these are some of the issues at work. Oatly has an issue because they want to be all natural, but if they use microbial engineering, they know they can make an enzyme that gets more of the oat nutrients out of the oat and into stuff that's good food. And the only question is it going to be considered natural or genetically modified or whatever? And so I'm trying to convince them that it's okay that an enzyme, right, that uses to break down the oat, it's not in the oat, is okay. I'm on the board of Oatly, full disclosure, but I'm a nerd scientist that said, you know, you'll still be okay, but we'll see. Okay, but there's much more you can do in biology. And it's a field called synthetic biology, where you can actually put in genes that normally you can't put in by crossbreeding. And let me give you a good example of synthetic biology where you can put in whole metabolic pathways. The idea is that you can turn algae into diesel or kerosene producing stuff. That is not yet economical, but what has happened is that people have taken a molecule, an enzyme from a bacteria that turned out to have natural insecticide properties, and they put it into eggplant. They also put it in potatoes and cotton. And the Bangladeshi farmers, eggplant is a huge staple crop of Bangladesh. They used to have to apply the insecticides every other day. They were drowning in it, and then to get rid of this so-called rootworm or shoot borer. And now with this, they don't have to do that anymore. So this is a good thing. Making golden rice, vitamin A, saves 1 million lives a year from malnutrition in young kids. So genetic modification does make sense if it's done right. And so I'm hoping that, and this is the adaptation of Bangladesh to this BT eggplant. They like it. It costs less. They make more money. So again, it's genetic modification. We have a fish issue. We're running out of a wild-caught fish. This is the wild-caught salmon from 1950, 2010, 11, it's even less. And so the majority of what we eat today of all fish in the world is farmed. Now, farm fishing has real downsides, so we have to clean up that. They can be very polluting. But there's other things you can do, and the question is, will the public accept it? Here's an example. If you take salmon and put in a growth hormone from the fastest growing Pacific salmon, so it's a hormone that's found in salmon, and you put in another a sequence, a promoter sequence. A promoter is something that tells the gene to keep on making this stuff, okay? So a promoter sequence from the ocean pout, so that salmon don't have yearly growth and quiescent stages. They grow all year round. And so this is one of those salmon, and this is another salmon raised under identical conditions. Now, it took 20 years to approve, and the use of this salmon is very stringent. They're in sealed water tanks. They're in water tanks on land, and the effluent from the water tanks has to be heavily filtered so none of the DNA can pass. But it's an opportunity, maybe, if public accepts this, that you can actually produce more food. Even more exciting is the fact that we can make microbes that enter into symbiotic relationships with grains that make their own fertilizer. So this is the root of a corn, and in this boundary between the soil and the root of the plant, there's things called rhizomes, and microbes can be made that when you plant the corn, you also take the microbes and implant it. And the downside is they don't last forever. The upside is if there's something bad, it goes away. So, but the good thing is you only use half the fertilizer, and hopefully you can get rid of all the fertilizer. And hopefully it can be done for all the major grains. Okay. What's new about this is our ability to manipulate genes is growing. There's a startup company called Zymergen, which uses this gene manipulation plus robotics plus other things and it collaborated with Pivot Bio to make these microbes. And so, again, full disclosure, I'm on the board of this company. But what being on the board of this company made me realize is the potential for manipulating microbes was hampered by the fact that you can only change one gene at a time. And in putting in a dozen genes to manipulate an organism, it takes years. One gene, one promoter, and you try different things, and you paste it all together, and you make more cell lines, and it's a big pain. And so if you could put in 10 genes at a time, the ability to test the waters goes up combinatorially because the DNA part's easy. You just type it in, and you can link it up. That part technology is easy. CRISPR-Cas systems, getting very powerful, okay? But you can only put one gene at a time because we stick them in for electroporation, but it's large cell death. Bacteria, only 10 kilobases. So in my lab, we just figured out how to put in 50,000 bases with high probability, with high survivability, massively parallel. I wouldn't know that this would have been important had I not known about synthetic biology a decade or two ago. But so this could be a big deal, but it ultimately needs public acceptance. Okay, so anyway, okay, so so what am I talking about? Improve crop yields, get rid of the fertilizer, get rid of the pesticides, put carbon back in the soil. Ever since we did deep plowing and other things, we've gotten rid of it. We need milk and meat substitutes, improve crop yields, less fossil-based stuff, drought resistance in plants. They're only the beginning to make the plants grow faster with less fertilizers. It's the N2O that's a bigger greenhouse gas than methane in terms of warming the climate. It's the fertilizer runoff. And so, and then finally, improve textiles. Cotton's great, except it doesn't take dyes very easily, and so it loses to lots of pollution unless you're careful. And so can you make the cotton take dyes better? It's just really small things, but it's, it's biology. Anyway, what about carbon? We're emitting carbon equivalent over 50 billion tons of carbon a year. We're certainly going to go over 450 ppm in the next decades. We're going to exceed 550, probably 600. And because it takes so long to completely change the agricultural sector, especially, electrification of vehicles, easy. Those things are easy compared to agriculture, plastics, and things like that. And so we'll need 10 or 20 gigatons per year to suck out of the atmosphere before the glaciers melt. Now, the fact that the bigger major glaciers are starting to melt and run off, and so it's like an avalanche. It starts to slide because the friction in the grounding line under the ocean has gone away. So it starts to slide, and it doesn't stop sliding until it refreezes and you restore the grounding line. The only way to restore the grounding line is do it artificially or lower the temperature of the Earth. That's it. So some major glaciers are running off at 1 kilometer a year. And that's not good. There's this old joke about the utility company executive. He gets despondent, he gets depressed. He decides to kill himself, so he throws himself in front of a glacier. No. Anyway, sorry, poor taste. So anyway, 10 or 20 gigatons, 10 or 20 billion tons a year. What are we experimenting with in the North Sea and Schleppner, which is, the gold, it's 1 million tons a year. 3 orders of magnitude. 4, really. So what has 4 orders of magnitude? Well, it turns out that the plants we plant for food, not Brazilian rape for sub-Saharan Africa, I'm talking about the plants for food, have photosynthesis. They capture 30 billion tons a year and turn into biomass, pasture another 48. And so if you can take 10 or 20 gigatons of the stuff that we have solar-powered carbon capture due to photosynthesis of food crops and other crops, and you can store it underground or permanently some way, it would be a very big deal. Oops, sorry. And fallow land, you can actually engineer the plant with minimal water and perennials, so a lot of nutrients aren't depleting the soil, like switchgrass. That's 1 year growth of switchgrass, or miscanthus. I think that's miscanthus. So you can have 4 or 5 times more biomass. So there are some people in Breakthrough Energy Ventures. I'm on the advisory board of this outfit. This is the thing that Bill Gates got his friends to put in $1 billion, then another $1 billion. They're thinking, what if you took the biomass from crops that you don't put back in the soil, that you would have burned, and dried it out, compacted, like put it into pellets, and then put it in a giant baggie. And we know how to make non-biodegradable plastics really well. And if you just seal it for 500 years, it's sequestered for 500 years. Kind of like when we built buildings that lasted 500 years, wooden buildings, that's carbon sequestration for 500 years. Instead of building steel and concrete buildings, we tear down in 50 years. So these things matter. And so if you can do this, it would be a big deal. How much land and biomass, and it's bulldozers, it's farmland, it's about equal to a landfill. So it's not crazy for a couple gigatons in the United States, like 3 or 4 gigatons. Okay, so let me end by talking about what the agricultural revolution started. Namely, we're successful. We create wealth, we grow food, population grows. So it took 1 million years, or let's say from Homo sapiens, 300,000 years, to grow to a population to get to this point over here. This is 1 billion. This is 1.1 billion years ago. And so we reached 1 billion over here at 1800, okay? Oh, so what's happening? Another 13 years, another billion. Okay? All right. All of the world economies and all the economists tell their leaders increased economic prosperity and global competitiveness is based on having more young people support a smaller aging population. That's how you grow. So this is what we call in the United States a pyramid scheme. For those of you who don't know what a pyramid scheme is, it's a fraudulent way of making money which is based on recruiting an ever-increasing of new investors to pay off the older investors. So if we have a lot more younger people to work on that, you can grow. Every company says we have to grow our market. A successful company make the stock go up is you have to have more customers and you have to sell more product. But what if you saturate the market? Well, then don't make them last as long. We don't make refrigerators that last 20 years. They last 6 years, 8 years. And the only thing that's keeping it last 4 years is there's a minor competition warranty. But if they all agree we're going to go to 8 years, it's okay. Cars that didn't work, they now last 20 years. Okay? Increased consumption. 1 car per family, not good enough. 1 car per adult, better. And so on. Okay? That plus increasing prosperity by making and selling more stuff. And so the fundamental thing of getting off this Ponzi scheme or pyramid scheme is that you need a redefinition of wealth, and wealth is based on producing and consuming more stuff, second homes and other things, and you need something different. We have a human development index which says that the logarithm of GDP per capita is 1, but also longevity and level of education are 2 other factors. that's more reflective of what we consider to be wealth on a personal level. But let's extend that. Quality of life would mean not only longevity, but an active, mentally active quality of life. Do you feel safe? Do you think your family, your children are safe? That no crazy is going to shoot your kid in kindergarten? Continuation, living comfort, stuff like that. This is what really matters. So for the last half dozen years, I'm talking to economists to say, why don't we, you guys understand this, why don't we redefine wealth? Because you can't even get climate change and sustainability are just out of the question until we stop this. And they kind of look at me and say, nah, that's too fuzzy. We know how to measure GDP. Happiness, forget about it. Well, to economists, happiness means you're just richer. But anyway, so there's an ongoing debate. I hope all of you enter into this debate. Convince your politicians not to, what was it, in one country, I think it was Hungary, says if you have 4 kids, no more income tax forever. This is not good. 7.7 billion going to 11 billion, and the good news is when people get wealthy, they have fewer kids. Even India, not even wealthy, the mean age per woman who is 2.3. In every other developed country is 1.3, 1.2, really small. Very rapid negative growth. Let it happen naturally. You can live better lives. We have automation, we have things. And just let the birth control happen naturally because, with great wealth, unfortunately, you have to pay for your kids' college education. But with great wealth, you have nighttime TV, so there's other things to do. Women's education. These are all good things. And women's independence. Okay, I've said enough, and so I'll stop.